So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. And I'd like to give a huge thanks to MedQ&A for sponsoring this webinar. And I also want to mention that I'm not a medical professional, and everything that I say in this webinar is purely for educational purposes and just speaks to my experiences and what I've learned. If you aren't watching this webinar live, then please feel free to go to medqa.com and record yourself asking a question, and either I or somebody who's knowledgeable in the autism community can get you an answer to that. And I will be muting the microphones during this presentation for about 20 minutes, and then I'll open it up to a Q&A session at the end where your microphones will be unmuted. And please feel free to ask any questions that you either have coming into this webinar or that arise during the course of the webinar, and I'll be happy to answer them. So we are gonna get started. Go. All right, so this webinar is going to be about fixing fixations. And to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Saralina Barrios, and I'm going to be a junior at Fordham College at Rose Hill in the fall, and I'm majoring in psychology. Some of my experience with autism has been through organizations in my community, and I volunteered with them, and I also have family members who are on the autism spectrum. I will be using the term ASD over the course of this webinar, which simply means autism spectrum disorder, and that is the latest diagnosis that has been given to people who are on the spectrum. And so for my summer program, I have been an intern with the American Autism Association. As it says on the bottom of the screen, I'm doing community outreach and fundraising. And to get started, we are going to discuss what qualifies as a fixation, distinctions between fixations in ASD, again, autism spectrum disorder, and OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. We're also going to discuss how routines factor into the discussion of fixations in the autism community, and what some common fixations are, and also the last question will be what to do if the fixation that you are observing in an individual with autism needs to be changed or stopped. So the first question that I have is what qualifies as a fixation? And there are a few questions that you can ask about the behavior that you're witnessing to assess whether or not it is truly a fixation. The first question would be, does the individual seem distressed as they are engaging in the behavior, or do they seem to be trying to resist the behavior? So are they sitting on their hands as they might be trying to engage in the behavior, or are they even hitting themselves as they engage in the behavior? The second question is, are they unable to stop independently? So do they require another individual, perhaps a parent, perhaps a teacher, to come in and help them stop engaging in the behavior or fixation? Does it impact their learning abilities? So are they in an educational setting where their learning is being inhibited by the behavior? And then is the behavior also possibly limiting their social experiences? Do their peers view this behavior as something that would give them pause in approaching the individual? And finally, the last question is it a significant disruption to somebody around the individual with autism? For instance, a family member, a rehabilitation worker, or anybody who is interacting with the individual. And so if you're able to answer yes to one or more of these questions, then the behavior may be a fixation. So we're on to the next question, which is, isn't that just OCD? Some people who know a little bit about OCD, again, obsessive compulsive disorder, are aware that it's marked by fixations in perhaps like an interest or a need to compulsively execute a behavior. But there's an important distinction between individuals who have OCD and ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And that is that for individuals with OCD, the fixated thoughts or behaviors that they're experiencing are disturbing to them. And individuals with ASD, these behaviors or fixations allow them to self-stimulate or stim. So the need for self-stimulation can come from a need for more sensory input, a need for less sensory input. It can help with coping with feelings of anxiety or stress or uncertainty. And it can also simply just be for enjoyment. So I also have, because I'm not an individual with autism, I don't think that I can fully speak for their perspective and their experience. So I do have a quote for you all from an individual with autism that describes his or her experience with these fixated behaviors. And the quote reads, as you can all read on the screen, "I quickly become overwhelmed in social situations. It is surprising that I then feel like blocking the world out. Is it surprising that I then feel like blocking the world out and literally putting my thoughts back in order, that I start to rock to tell myself which feelings are mine, that I start speaking to myself or groaning to block out other sounds so that I know which thoughts are mine? I think anyone experiencing life in this way would do the same." So I really like this quote because I think that it emphasizes that for individuals with autism, these can be a very logical reaction to certain stimuli that they're experiencing. So it's not just a random series of thoughts and they've just decided to do this for no reason. There is a clear path in his or her mind for the reason that this behavior is useful to them. So the next question that we have is, what about repetitive routines? And throughout my research, I've noticed that repetitive routines in individuals with ASD is a fairly neglected area of research, but there are a few common routines that we see in individuals with autism, and those are having objects placed in a particular order or place, using certain routes to get to certain places, using a schedule, a daily schedule or a timetable to give a more certain aspect or quality to the day so that they know that what's coming next, or a refusal to eat certain foods or foods that aren't prepared in a certain way. And if you notice that routine is becoming an issue for an individual with autism, there are again a few questions that you can ask to find out if this routine needs to be changed. And there are 4 questions, the first of which is, does the routine endanger the individual or people around the individual? The second is, does it increase the likelihood of social rejection for the individual? So again, do his or her peers see this as a reason not to approach the individual, not to engage with him or her? And then another question is, does it interfere with education or enjoyment? And finally, what I personally think is the most important question is, will this behavior or routine still be acceptable in 5 years? And so with an individual with autism, routines can be very important in his or her, in the individual's life. And so it's important to look to the future to make sure that the behavior that the individual is engaging in will be acceptable in the long run, because he or she is not going to want to stop the behavior very quickly, at least. So those are some of the questions to figure out if the routine needs to be changed. And again, if you can answer yes to one or more of these, then perhaps that would apply. The next question is, what are some common fixations? So for this section of the presentation, I'm going to break the topic of fixations down into interests and behaviors. So the first aspect of this is the interest section. And so common fixations in the interest category are pretty much anything. An individual can just find pretty much anything really interesting, really fascinating. As I mentioned at the beginning, I have some family members who are on the spectrum. One of them is my cousin, and I'll just give you a few examples of the fixations or interests that he's had over the past, 19 years of his life. But so it started a little bit with Thomas the Tank Engine. It moved on to different types of trains. And then there was also, he was really interested in SpongeBob, and then Transformers, which is the phase that we're in now. So I know a lot about Transformers. And so these are all phases that he went through. So he grew in and out of a lot of these. But there are also fixations in the interest category that he's been able to incorporate throughout his life. So from childhood to adulthood, pretty much now. And that's one of those is the color red. So he had a real interest fixation on the color red when he was a child, and he's still been able to incorporate that into his life with a red coat, a red backpack, things like that. So, and then I also, again, do not want to speak for an individual with autism. So I have another quote from an individual. And this quote reads, "My mind was constantly worrying with thoughts, worries, and concerns. The time spent with my obsession was the only time in which I had a clear mind, and it gave me that much sought after relaxation." So I again want to highlight that this quote is again a very logical explanation of a fixated interest, or in this person's word, obsession, where they are using it in order to achieve that sense of calm and a decrease of anxiety. And then I also want to go into the behavior part of fixations. So some common fixations in the behavior category can be rocking, flapping, jumping, head banging, use of a particular object, or echolalia, which is a really interesting topic and truthfully could fill up an entire other webinar. But I'll give you guys just the basic definition, which is the immediate or delayed repetition of language. So this can also qualify as a behavior even though it's through language. And this can be either repeating the exact same thing you've just said right back to you, or it can be an individual with autism repeating something that they've heard in the past and using it later on. And the next question is, what if I need to change or stop the behavior? And I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer that I mentioned a little bit, that an individual with autism is simply that, just an individual with autism. And one thing that works for one individual may not work for another. And so I think that it's really important, if you're here to learn to apply these steps to an individual with autism, that you really take them with a grain of salt. You figure out which ones can work for you and your experience, and which ones maybe won't, and you won't use those. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as I go through some steps that may be useful for some and may not be useful for others. But the first step, which may, contrary to what I just said, be useful for most people, is that you really need to understand why the behavior is occurring. I mentioned a little bit about how this does follow a logical path for most individuals with autism, and there will be something that happens before the behavior that they are reacting to. So in order to properly observe and understand the behavior, you should look at what happens right before the behavior occurs, what happens while the behavior is occurring, and what happens after the behavior occurs, or what stops the behavior from occurring. To better understand why the individual is acting that way. Is it due to anxiety? Is it due to boredom? Is it just for enjoyment? So really understand the basis for the behavior. And so the second step that you may want to take is to modify the environment. If you notice that an individual with autism reacts a certain way in a particular environment, whether that be in a classroom, in a certain area of a building, you may want to look at that environment to see if there's anything in it that could be triggering the behavior that you'd like to change, the fixation you'd like to change. So perhaps the classroom is too bright, perhaps the classroom is too noisy for the individual, and realizing and taking steps to change that can change or even stop the behavior completely. The second step that you can take is to increase structure. So this is if maybe the behavior is happening out of boredom or a lack of stimulus. So to increase structure, you can introduce perhaps more activities right when the behavior is about to occur, or maybe the same activity but just in a more structured environment, in a more structured method. And you can also include the idea of a schedule or a time marker into the individual's day, or even just an explanation of what's going on and what's going to happen next. The idea that waiting is an activity can be very useful for an individual with autism who may have to make themselves busy during a specific time of the day where there isn't a scheduled activity. Another step that you can take is to manage anxiety. So again, if the behavior is occurring out of anxiety, so this is different from the other two steps that I've just listed, but if the behavior is happening out of anxiety and you're aware of that and you're aware of steps to take to decrease the anxiety of the individual, then by all means take those steps and then see if the behavior does stop or change. And if you aren't aware of things that you can do in order to decrease the individual's anxiety, don't feel scared to consult a professional, and they can give you really individualized and specific information that will benefit your child or individual with autism. And the next step that you can take is to intervene early. I mentioned a little bit about routines, and routines are a little bit different from fixations because they're going to be much harder to break because they've been allowed to continue for a long time. And in order to, if you want to stop a fixation or routine that's happening, then you have to start early because that's what's going to make it much easier to change the behavior if you haven't let it continue for a very long time. The next step you can take is to set boundaries. So this can come in the form of maybe time limits. So this is for maybe if an individual has a specific interest in something. I mentioned SpongeBob. So for my cousin, if we let him talk about SpongeBob for maybe 15 minutes a day, and that's all he's allowed, and then there's a strict boundary where he cannot talk about that anymore. And then that will then change behavior so he's not talking about it for the whole day. And then you can even work into the boundaries that you've set, maybe a weekly or daily or even monthly decrease in the behavior. So we go from 15 minutes to 10 minutes, maybe to 5 minutes, in whatever time span will work for the individual that you're working with. Another step that you could take is to provide alternatives to the behavior. For instance, if an individual that you're working with really likes to rock back and forth, perhaps they can only rock back and forth when they're on a swing set. So you've taken a behavior that is not as socially acceptable and placed it in a more socially acceptable environment so that they're allowed to continue that behavior that gives them maybe a sense of calm, that we mentioned any good feelings that other people won't view as strange and won't impact them socially. You can also support skill development in things like communication and conversation. So that would be for social skills. So maybe an individual talks about SpongeBob when he or she is uncomfortable in a social situation, is uncomfortable in a conversation. Building those social skills and helping them to be more comfortable in a conversation will then decrease the talk about a TV show by default. There's another, if it's not social skills, you can also do self-regulation skills, which is if the behavior is occurring out of anxiety, then self-regulation skills can help the individual realize and recognize those feelings within him or herself and find a more appropriate way to get rid of those feelings or to use those feelings more productively. And the final message that I'd like to give you guys is to maybe even make use of the fixations rather than stopping them or getting them to stop talking about something that they're really interested in, then to make use of them and to show an interest in them and perhaps allow them to engage in this interest in a more productive way. So I have a few examples that if maybe an individual showing a real interest in computers, then perhaps a job in IT could be a way to use that interest in a socially beneficial way. Or there's another example, if they are really interested in keeping things in order, whether it's alphabetical order, numerical order, they can translate that into a job at maybe a library, restacking books. And another one, just to round it out with a third, is if they have a really firm interest in a particular sound, to translate that into a musical interest and even maybe a musical instrument that they can play. But this really just requires a little bit of creativity on the part of the caretaker to figure out how you can look at the individual with autism and place them in a setting where they can thrive with this interest. And I, again, have one more quote for you all from an individual with autism. So the quote reads, "Showing an interest in a child's obsession can help a parent to enjoy a level of communication that had perhaps never seemed achievable before." All right. And now I'd like to open it up to questions from you all. And I'm gonna do that. Oh. There we go.
Sarah Elena.
Yes.
What age would you suggest you start intervention for the fixation?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't get that.
At what age would you suggest you start the intervention for the fixations?
I mean, it depends what fixations you are trying to stop. So I mean, if you look back on the questions that were asked, will it be acceptable in 5 years' time? I think that's always a really good marker of when you should attempt to start changing them, because 5 years is a long time, and it's going to give you plenty of time to discuss with the individual with autism or with the caretakers of that individual how to proceed in decreasing the fixation in a beneficial way.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I got a question.
Sure.
I guess not all fixations would necessarily need to be addressed, though, right? I mean, like you mentioned someone wearing red. I mean, that's pretty harmless, isn't it?
Yeah, so that was one of the ones that I mentioned that he has been able to incorporate into his adult life, but there's, of course, different severities almost of fixations where how fixated the individual can be on something. So, for instance, my cousin, if he was, let's say, only wearing red and wanted to only wear one red shirt of his, then that would be a fixation probably that would need to be addressed and need to be changed.
Okay.
But if he is okay with just using a red backpack, then that's great. But it depends on the individual and what sort of social or even occupational situations that they're in and how acceptable those fixations are.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So, Sarah Helena, if he chooses to wear only red shirts, that would be fine. Would that not be? Not just one red shirt?
All right, so sorry about that. That depends on how comfortable you are with the behavior. This is, like I said, a very individualized process where if you're okay with the individual just wearing red shirts and he's okay, or he or she is okay with it, then by all means, that sounds good. But if you'd like to change that, and it depends on how comfortable you and the individual are with how to proceed.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
So I understand that autism is, a whole spectrum and everyone's different. But is there anything that maybe people have, or maybe scientists, I don't know, in general, that have noticed that kids or people with autism tend to fixate on specifically? Like, is it maybe now that with the age of technology, it's more like technological things that they tend to fixate on, or more number things or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about scientifically or how many studies there have been, and also there's also a question of the legitimacy of all those studies, as there always is. But I have personally have noticed that there's definitely a fixation on technology with my own personal experiences with individuals with autism, and I think that can be a really great thing. Like I said, it can lead to real job opportunities where also we know with autism that social communication can be more difficult for those individuals, and so opening up computers and more digital or virtual communication and technology can be really beneficial. And I think that is absolutely possible that individuals with autism are more drawn to technology.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hi.
Sure.
Hi. How would you, I know you said that fixations are harder to address the longer that they have them, and essentially the older the person gets. Mm-hmm. So how would you suggest that a caretaker of an older person on the spectrum, help them with their first fixations? Are there therapies? Are there ways to do it at home if you don't have the money for that kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, there's, of course, therapies, and there are different workers that can help with those sort of fixations. But it is going to, I think, just be a longer process. I think with children are more willing to change, sort of. And I say that with a lot of hesitation because I realize that individuals with autism can already be resistant to change. But just based on neurological makeup, children are going to be more acceptable or amenable to change. So I think it's just going to be a longer process with individuals with autism. I never want to discount the ability of an adult with autism to change and to make them drive. But it does take, it's going to be about consistency and best interests at heart to get them to a place where their fixations can be socially acceptable.
Thank you.
No problem. questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Should the goal be to help your child deal with social situations, or is it realistic to try to help your child stop fixating on something because there's some chance that he could not be quite as autistic? So what is the goal exactly? What should the goal be? And how realistic is it to move somebody so that they're not quite as autistic? I don't even know if it's possible.
I think so your question is more along the lines of how to make a fixation more acceptable, sort of? Like, because I don't think that it's about making somebody more or less autistic. It just may be allowing them to better function in the situations that they're put in.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because, sometimes it might be a good thing to have a fixation. I mean, if I were fixating on Transformers instead of, on professional problems, for instance, I'd be much better off, So, it would really depend on what the goal is, I think. And if the goal is not to make my child, for instance, less autistic, and the goal is instead just to help him be perceived in a better way in society, then I might give him a certain, I might ask him to, or give him certain direction, and then if the goal were something else, I might give him another direction. So
Sure.
So that was my question. I mean, I wasn't sure whether it was even possible, if you modify an autistic child's behavior enough, whether or not they could stop being autistic. I mean, I'm sure it's a very ignorant thing to ask, but.
Yeah, no, I think that, so it's a diagnosis based on the different, so it's developmental disorder that is based on issues with communication and different, like there's a very specific diagnosis that's actually available in the DP5, I believe it is. But so in regards to making perhaps like symptoms almost of autism more or less visible, I think it's really important to narrow down what your goal is at the very beginning of trying to change or stop the behavior. So if your goal is to stop the behavior completely and make it so that they are not interested in it at all, that is something that is possible, and that's a goal that may be relevant to some people. But there's also the goal of you want to change the behavior. So if, for instance, again, Transformers, if the individual will only talk about Transformers from noon to night, then that may be an issue that you see in his or her life. But if they're just talking about it if you want the goal to be them just talking about it with a certain individual who shares that interest, or they're only talking about it a little bit to where it doesn't inhibit their social interactions, then that's another goal. So I think that it's just important to assess the individual that you're working with and figure out what your goals for him or her are in the future. And when I say to stop a fixation or to stop a behavior, that's only if you feel that that's necessary. I'm absolutely not saying that every fixation and every individual with autism needs to be stopped or changed. This is only if you are feeling that it answers one of those questions that I listed at the beginning. So is it giving them distress? Is it inhibiting their social interactions? So it's a very personalized process, like I mentioned, and it's really about what you want from your individual with autism and what the individual with autism feels is right for him or her.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Are there any more questions? Please feel free. Okay. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. Please feel free to visit Med Q&A if any questions arise and you want to record them for me or another person who is knowledgeable in the field of autism, and we'd be happy to get back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.